Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this fifth episode of the Tsunami is Coming podcast on issues that keep people up at night. It's with great pleasure that I'm greeting today a personal friend of mine, someone I've known and admired for quite some time, Alastair Newton. Alastair, thank you very much for joining me today in this conversation. You're
Pleasure.
a professional, thank you, sorry. You are a professional political analyst, and you've done this for a little bit of time. I want to say all over the place. You are in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, in North America, the United States in particular. I'm almost sure that this question, what keeps you up at night? I think you gave me inspiration directly or indirectly. Maybe you'll tell us more about that in a few moments. But thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. It's a great pleasure to be working with you again. As you said, we've known each other for a lot of years now, and I'm going to touch on one or two of those years, I suspect, in this conversation. To answer your question about issues which keep me up at night, keep me awake at night, it was an idea which was given to me when I first went to work for Lehman Brothers in 2005 for what became a series of papers on political risk and financial markets, a series which still exists today. So it's been going for 21 years. I'm very happy to be plagiarized by you. It's a compliment. So yeah, thanks very much indeed. And let's get to what's keeping us, probably both of us, up at the moment, actually.
Yeah. So tell us, what keeps you up at night right now?
Well, when you put the question to me, I had 1,001 ideas because, as you know, for many years, actually, all the way back to 2008, one of the themes which I've been talking about very regularly is what happens at the end of a period of hegemony, which is exactly where we are now. And
Yeah.
in many respects, I feel really privileged to be living through this period, especially as I'm actually old enough to remember the last days of the British and, for that matter, the French Empire. So, in a way, I've seen the end of one hegemon already, and I'm now looking at the beginning of the end of another. And I guess if there's one thing which does keep me awake at night more than anything else, it's sheer frustration at not knowing how this is all going to end. Because at my age, I can't expect to do that. But living through it right now is a real privilege. And we could talk a lot about the classic stuff, Thucydides as trap, China, US, and all that. And obviously, people do need to worry about that. We could talk about issues which have nothing to do with politics as such, but which are deeply politicized, such as climate change. But what I really would like to talk about today is Europe, partly because it's very topical, partly because I don't think it gets enough attention, and partly because I think you can look at Europe in two ways at the moment. You can either look at it as a complete disaster zone, consistent with some of the things which you've written for Tsunami is Coming. And incidentally, I have to say, I don't totally agree with your title. I think it's already here, the tsunami. Um, but you were ahead of it originally, so take pride in that. Um, the other way you can look at it is that I think since Brexit in 2016, Europe has regained an ability it lost probably from the end of the Cold War onwards, maybe the Maastricht Treaty, uh, to take advantage of crises and move forward. And I do think that Europe is already moving forward in many respects. I thought that Friedrich Merz's presentation at the Munich Security Conference, for example, coming from a German, if it had been Macron, it wouldn't have attracted much interest. But coming from the Chancellor of Germany, I think it showed a degree of intent and change of direction for Germany, which is really important. But the question is, can Europe move forward fast enough, soon enough? And that's what really concerns me when I look at the propensity for Europe to spend a lot of time bickering about angels on pinheads instead of getting down to the real issues. And I'm not talking about the likes of Viktor Orban here. I mean, clearly, one can hardly ignore Mr. Orban, and who knows, maybe the Hungarians will decide they're going to ignore him enough in the upcoming election that the Oban era will be history. Um, I'm actually talking about some of the mainstream countries, Spain, Italy, even France, and that's irrespective of the outcome of the French uh, presidential election, which is now looming on the very near horizon. Also, we've got a very weak government in Germany. And when I look around at the strong countries in Europe today, I see people like the Baltic republics. I see Stubb in Finland, who I think has become a remarkable leader coming from a country of just 5.5 million people. And for anyone who's watching this who has not seen Stubb's interview with The Economist, which was broadcast for the first time yesterday, I strongly recommend it if you've got access to it. He's an interesting character. And if you can't see the interview, then get hold of his book because it's a very good read and has some great insights into Donald Trump, which I think are far more balanced than you get from most commentators. But clearly, Europe is beset with challenges. And I guess I'm going to put a couple of specifics on the table right now. I still believe, despite the fact that I was wrong about this last year, that we are in for a major transatlantic trade war. And I think that is coming very soon indeed. And I think the main reason for it is going to revolve around Digital Services Act and similar legislation in Europe, which is anathema to the tech titans in the US who have enormous influence over Donald Trump, combined with the fact that, Marco Rubio didn't change anything in Munich. He just dressed it up more nicely. But basically, his message was the same. We need you guys to fall into line and understand that this is a battle for white Christian civilization. Well, I'm sorry, but Europe's not going to play that game. And Trump's animus towards Europe and the European Union in particular, and America's insistence on nation state as the principal means of governance rather than plurilateral organizations like the European Union is a real threat to Europe because the Americans are going to continue to do whatever they can to try to dismantle the European Union. And that is a massive threat in this era when even the British are starting to learn the hard way that being on your own is not a great place to be in 2026.
Hmm. Alistair, to play devil's advocate on Europe, it kind of feels like we know exactly what the Europeans need to do. This
Mm.
very well celebrated Draghi report had many merits, and one in particular to actually put that on paper again,
Yeah.
but in a very formal way. Uh, um, how can we still be optimistic about Europe's ability to get its act together when everyone agrees on what the problem is, everyone agrees what needs to be done, and yet there's absolutely no real leadership at the European level to bring this forward?
Well, you're right about the absence of leadership. And you're also right to be echoing Jean-Claude Juncker, who, of course, famously said, we all know what we've got to do, but we don't know how to do it and get re-elected.
Hmm.
And that, too, offers a very real threat in Europe insofar as the Americans are going to continue to do what they can to boost these far-right parties and help them to win elections. I actually think that Trump is, in some way, respects hindering those parties to win elections. In fact, association with Donald Trump is not good for the likes of Alternative for Deutschland, to take
Hmm.
one example. Um, so I think the short answer to your question, Jeremy, is that we have to be patient. Um, Churchill famously said about the Americans many years ago, they always do the right thing, but only after they've exhausted every possible alternative. And I rather feel that about the European Union these days. I think they will get there, but in these days of 24-hour news, news cycle changing all the time. Donald Trump, brilliant man at manipulating the news feed to suit himself, changing the topic all the time, bringing it onto things he wants, getting people to forget about things they should be thinking about. And I'm not necessarily thinking about Jeffrey Epstein, but there's a load of other stuff that Americans need to be focused on, which Trump is brilliant at distracting them from. I think, we are too impatient with Europe. The nature of the European Union is such that it is always going to take its time to come to the right place. But I'm very confident that it will get there out of sheer necessity in the end. I'm very confident, for example, Europe is beginning to realize and will get to the point where it understands that it actually needs to work with China rather than trying to keep China at arm's length. You can't sustain the multilateral trading system when the world's biggest economy has dropped out of it and the world and without doing business with the world's biggest trading economy.
Mm.
So I think Europe has got to come round to this. And when you see individual European leaders going off to Beijing, talking seriously with Xi Jinping about the way forward, with all due respect, the European Commission has got to get its mind around this. And I think Callas is very good in many respects, but her "we're not doing business with China" statement a few weeks ago, a few days ago actually, was not smart. You've got to
Mm.
do business with China. Apart from anything else, Europe is going to need all that technology. China has cornered the market in so many technologies. It's not just about rare earths. And China will have another choke point before long because it knows that the value of rare earths as a choke point will expire in a few years' time when Europe and the US and others have responded. But it'll have something else up its sleeve as leverage. And we've got to learn to deal with that. The Europeans have got to learn to deal with that. The world's got to learn to deal with that. I'm sitting here in Zambia. We have to learn to deal with it. We do business with the Chinese here all the time. They build great roads, they build great solar installations. Um, there's a price to pay for doing business with China, but you've got to accept it. Um,
Yeah.
and it's not. I'm not talking about corruption. The Chinese will do business however you want to do business. I remember many years ago at a meeting to which I took investors in Rwanda. The president said, President Kagame said, actually, it was up to Africans to sort out how they wanted to do business with China. And if Africans were prepared to do business honestly, China would do business honestly. And he was right.
Yeah. There's one crazy and ironic twist of history in what you said as well, which is if Europe does do business with China, you can expect some technology transfers, and you could actually see Europeans demanding that. And that's one heck of a twist, right? Because usually the technology transfers, historically speaking, were the other way. Is
Yeah.
that a sign of that end of dominance that you opened this whole conversation with, perhaps?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, China, the new 5-year plan will be formally signed off uh, probably about a week after you broadcast this podcast, and it will be very tech focused indeed, and it will also be very based still on an export led economic growth model. China is not going to move away from that. I'm afraid it's going to continue to be looking at supply side stimuli at home rather than demand side stimuli, which means it's going to be highly dependent on export markets. The way to deal with that for Europe is not tariffs. Trump's tried that and he's going to finish up losing that battle with Xi Jinping for sure. Not just yet. Xi Jinping will take his time, extract every last cent he can out of America along the way. This is a battle that Xi Jinping has been planning for years. Donald Trump has probably been thinking about it for the last 5 minutes, maybe not even that long. Um, but Europe's way forward has got to be saying, come and build it in Europe. Don't build it in China and sell it to us. Come here, build it here, build those solar panels here, build those data centers here. Um, Europe has an advantage there because Europe has one big weapon when it comes to AI and high tech, and that's ASML, which is a
Mm.
unique asset. And the Chinese need that, the Americans need that. And the Europeans have got to get their mind around the fact that they've got to do business with China and they're going to have to take a tough line with America sooner or later. The anti coercion instrument is going to have to be unveiled, in my view. And they're going to have to remember that actually America thinks it's got what the military people and now the trade people call escalation dominance. But I'm not sure that it actually has. I think the Europeans have got an awful lot of ability to escalate successfully, provided that European voters are prepared to put up with a bit of pain along the way.
Mm. Well, that's the perfect segue to the last question I wanted to ask you. Something you alluded to that kind of feels like the elephant in the room, namely the French elections coming in what am I saying? 18 months, a little bit less
Yeah.
than 18 months now. In a private conversation a couple of days ago, it occurred to me that look at the governments of Spain and Italy. They don't look like any mainstream government if you used the metrics we used 10 years ago, right? And nothing happened. Is the election in France that big of a deal? And to be perfectly clear and transparent on what we're talking about, would a far-right president really change the deal for Europe in the way you've told us it kept you up at night?
I think that had we been having this conversation even 2 years ago,
Hmm.
I would have given you quite a different answer to the one I'm going to give you today. But I'm going to start from a point I would have started from 2 years ago, and that is that when far right or indeed far left parties get into power, they
Right.
get found out because suddenly all those things that you can get away with saying in opposition run up
Exactly.
against real life.
Hmm.
And real life is a hell of a lot more difficult than sitting on the opposition benches and talking to the media about what you're going to do when you get into power. When you do get into power, then the media is going to be talking to you about what you're not doing.
Hmm.
Um, and that's when your problems start to arrive. And I think Italy is quite a good example of how pragmatism has got the better of polemics in the Italian government. And I would expect to see probably something very similar happen in France. Now, of course, being France, you'll try a few other things on the way, as usual. I mean, I'm old enough. I'm not sure if you're old enough to remember Mitterrand's early years. Are you?
I was a little young at the time.
Yeah, precisely. Well, I can remember Mitterrand's early years, and he tried all sorts of things and then basically had to come back into being a pragmatist.
Hmm.
And, um, you know, there is there are two phrases which I learned in France which apply to all sorts of circumstances, but which also apply to the possibility of a right winger sitting in the Elysee Palace in a few months' time. I can I can see that you're going to hear there's two phrases you're going to hear a lot of occasions. The first is en principe,
Hmm.
and the second is normalement.
Hmm.
And we both know that's the way it's going to be. Suddenly, things are going to change. And I think the reason that I'm giving you a different answer today to the one I would have given you 2 years ago, I think the Europeans have actually got a lot to thank Donald Trump for. If you have the opportunity to choose your enemy, you probably would not manage to come up with something as helpful as Donald Trump thinking, because you wouldn't think it could possibly exist. But for Europe, I think Trump, I think the MAGA movement, I think JD Vance, who actually I have a sneaking suspicion might be the next president of the United States in 2029, because I don't think they're going to let the Democrats win the 2028 election. I
Hmm.
think they're actually a gift to help to push Europe forward and to help to push those right wingers who are certainly going to continue to play an important part in European politics into a more pragmatic and more pro European, which I think is also very important. If we think about the journey that Le Pen has made from wanting to take France out of the European Union, obviously she saw what happened in the UK and realized that wasn't too sensible. But wanting to reform Europe, whatever that means,
Hmm.
um, well, we may get to see in 18 months' time.
Yeah. Well, will you come again then?
I'll come before that if you want me to. But
Absolutely.
what one of the things I want to sum up with, Jeremy, is it's very easy to be very pessimistic about the
Yeah.
world today.
Yeah.
Um, and I live in the Zambezi Valley, and we get floods every year. Tsunamis, no, but floods, yes. And what the floods do is they make the land more fertile.
Hmm.
And I do think that there is a lot to be said for tsunamis shaking up the languor which had infected Europe and hopefully helping Europe to drive forward to a better future, despite all the challenges, despite climate change, despite the demographics, despite the politics, despite the low productivity compared to the US. all these things are fixable. And Europe actually has the brain power, has the intellectual grasp, has the rule of law to be successful in doing that. So I'm actually pretty optimistic about Europe.